The field was silent long before the fighting began. Mist drifted across damp earth as two armies faced each other beneath a pale northern sky. On one side stood men confident in their numbers, certain that the northern raiders before them would break like so many scattered warbands had before. They expected noise, fury, and reckless charges. Instead, they were met with stillness. The Viking line did not rush. Shields rose slowly, overlapping with deliberate precision. Spears angled forward in unison. No shouting. No chaos. Just a steady breath shared by every man in the rank. To outsiders, the Vikings were remembered as unpredictable raiders who appeared from the sea without warning. But on the battlefield, something else defined them. Before every major clash, there was a moment, unwritten, rarely recorded, when discipline replaced impulse and unity replaced individual glory. It was not superstition. It was not madness. It was a rule. A silent understanding that once the line was formed, no man stood alone. And when the first charge finally came, it did not meet chaos. It met a wall. To understand how such discipline emerged, you have to look north to the lands that shaped it. Scandinavia in the 8th and 9th centuries was not a single kingdom but a fractured world of fjords, forests, and scattered settlements. Narrow strips of farmland clung to rocky coastlines, and long winters tested endurance as much as strength. Survival depended on cooperation. A failed harvest could mean starvation. A weak leader could mean invasion. In such an environment, disorder was a luxury no community could afford. Power rested in the hands of jarls and petty kings, each ruling small territories bound together by loyalty rather than centralized law. Leadership was not secured by bloodline alone. It had to be defended constantly. A chieftain who failed in war or lost the confidence of his warriors risked replacement. Feuds between families could last generations, and vengeance was not merely emotional, it was expected. Reputation functioned as currency. A man's name determined whether others would stand beside him when steel was drawn. At the heart of this society stood the Thing, pronounced Ting, an assembly where disputes were settled and alliances affirmed. Oaths spoken there carried enormous weight. To swear loyalty was to bind oneself publicly, before witnesses and gods alike. Breaking such an oath meant more than shame, it could mean exile. In Norse law, an outlaw was stripped of protection. Anyone could kill him without consequence. The threat of exclusion was as powerful as any blade. Religion reinforced this structure. The gods of the Norse world valued courage and resolve. Odin, associated with both wisdom and war, embodied cunning as much as strength. Warriors believed that dying bravely might grant them entry to Valhalla, where fallen fighters prepared for Ragnarok, the final battle. Fear of death did not disappear, but it was reframed. Honor and unity became pathways to immortality in story and spirit. From this harsh landscape emerged a simple truth: survival required cohesion. A warrior who abandoned his place endangered everyone. A leader who failed to command unity invited collapse. Long before shields met in battle, the foundations of discipline were already laid in law, belief, and necessity. Before swords ever crossed, there was a moment that mattered more than the clash itself. Viking armies did not simply assemble and charge. They prepared together, bound not only by strategy but by oath. In halls lit by firelight or on open ground beneath a gray sky, warriors gathered around their leaders and swore loyalty before battle. Hands rested on sword hilts or sacred arm rings as vows were spoken aloud. These were not casual promises. They were declarations made before witnesses, before comrades, and before the gods who were believed to watch from above. Once given, such an oath could not be withdrawn without consequence. The act of swearing together transformed individuals into something larger. A farmer who had taken up a spear was no longer fighting for personal glory alone. He was bound to the man beside him. To abandon the line would not simply risk defeat, it would break faith with the entire company. In a culture where reputation followed a man for life and beyond, that was a cost few were willing to pay. The oath created accountability. It ensured that courage was not left to chance. This unity became visible the moment shields rose. The shield wall was not just a tactic, it was a physical expression of the vow. Each round shield overlapped the next, forming a barrier that depended on trust. A single gap could unravel the formation. Every warrior understood that his strength meant nothing if the line fractured. The oath demanded that no one chase recklessly and no one retreat without command. Discipline replaced impulse. When the great heathen army landed in England in 865 under leaders like Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan Ragnarsson, their coordination stunned their enemies. These were not scattered raiders acting independently. They moved as one force, maintaining cohesion even through winter campaigns and prolonged sieges. That unity did not appear by accident. It was reinforced before every major engagement, rooted in a shared understanding that once battle began, the line would hold. Breaking such a rule meant more than fear of death. It meant dishonor. And in the Viking world, dishonor could outlive a man far longer than any wound. When the oath had been spoken and the line assembled, discipline took its most visible form in the shield wall. At first glance it seemed simple: round wooden shields pressed edge to edge, iron bosses aligned, spears angled forward. But beneath that simplicity lay coordination refined through repetition and trust. The front rank absorbed the first impact, bracing against the weight of charging enemies. Behind them stood spearmen who thrust over shoulders in measured rhythm, and farther back, warriors armed with heavy two-handed Dane axes waited for the precise moment to strike. Each layer depended on the others. No man fought alone. The strength of the formation was not in individual fury but in restraint. A warrior who stepped forward too far could expose the line. One who retreated too soon could create panic. The rule demanded that every movement be deliberate. Shields rose and lowered together. Boots advanced in unison, pressing forward steadily rather than rushing. To an opponent expecting wild raiders, the experience was unsettling. Charges that should have shattered a loose band instead rebounded off an unyielding barrier. Battles such as Ashdown in 871 revealed how cohesion could offset numbers and uncertainty. Even when facing determined Anglo-Saxon forces, Viking formations held long enough to absorb the shock of impact and then counter with disciplined aggression. At Fulford in 1066, similar coordination allowed Norse warriors under Harald Hardrada to exploit weaknesses along the English flank. The wall did not simply stand, it shifted, adjusted, and pressed. Sound became part of the strategy. Shields struck in synchronized rhythm, a thunderous pulse that echoed across the field. War cries rose not as chaotic screams but as unified bursts that amplified presence and intention. The psychological effect was powerful. An enemy who expected disorder found structure instead. Confidence began to falter. Hesitation spread. The shield wall was more than wood and iron. It was a visible reminder of the oath that bound the men behind it. As long as the line held, so did their promise. And as long as that promise endured, the wall became something more than a tactic, it became a symbol of collective strength that few armies were prepared to break. Yet the secret rule was not only about standing firm. It was also about knowing when not to. Discipline gave Viking commanders the confidence to control the pace of battle, to resist the instinct to chase victory too early or panic at the first setback. Where other forces relied on raw momentum, Viking strategy often relied on patience. A line could bend without breaking. A retreat could be measured rather than desperate. And sometimes, what looked like weakness was carefully designed deception. Feigned retreats became one of the most unsettling tools in their arsenal. A section of the line would begin to withdraw in controlled steps, shield still raised, formation not fully collapsing but appearing strained. To an enemy commander, this looked like opportunity. Orders would be shouted. Men would surge forward, eager to exploit what seemed like a fracture. But in the rush, cohesion dissolved. Ranks stretched thin. The pursuit became disorganized. That was the moment the Vikings waited for. Horn signals would cut through the noise, and the retreating warriors would halt and reform. Fresh fighters from reserve positions would surge forward, striking against an opponent who had overextended himself. This kind of maneuver required absolute trust. Every warrior had to understand that falling back did not mean surrender. It meant timing. The oath sworn before battle ensured that no one mistook discipline for defeat. Without that shared understanding, a retreat could become a rout. With it, the movement became a weapon. Mobility reinforced this patience. Longships allowed Viking forces to disengage entirely if conditions turned unfavorable. Along rivers like the Seine in 845 or during prolonged campaigns such as the Siege of Paris in 885 to 886, they demonstrated that battle was not always decided in a single clash. They could withdraw, regroup, and strike again where defenses were weakest. The enemy, forced to guard vast territories, grew exhausted chasing a force that refused to fight on predictable terms. Psychologically, this approach was devastating. Armies trained to expect straightforward engagement instead faced uncertainty. Was the withdrawal genuine? Was the line truly broken? Doubt crept into decisions. And in medieval warfare, doubt could spread faster than fear. The rule demanded patience as much as courage. It required warriors to suppress pride, to wait for the right moment rather than seize the first. In doing so, they turned discipline into flexibility, and flexibility into dominance. Discipline did not sustain itself through inspiration alone. In the Viking world, unity was enforced as much as it was encouraged. A warrior who broke formation or abandoned his oath endangered more than a single battle, he threatened the survival of the entire warband. Because of that, loyalty carried weight, and failure carried consequences. Honor was not an abstract concept, it was a measurable force that shaped how a man was treated in life and remembered after death. At the center of this system stood the Thing, the public assembly where disputes were judged and reputations weighed. Accusations of cowardice or betrayal could be brought before witnesses. If proven, the consequences were severe. Fines might be imposed, property confiscated, alliances broken. But the harshest punishment was outlawry. To be declared an outlaw was to be stripped of legal protection. No one was obligated to shelter you. Anyone could kill you without penalty. In a society built on kinship and mutual defense, exile was almost a death sentence. Saga literature preserves echoes of this mindset. Stories celebrated those who held their ground and condemned those who faltered. Memory was long. A man known for abandoning comrades might struggle to find allies in future conflicts. No jarl wanted a reputation for leading unreliable warriors. And no warrior wanted to be remembered as the one who failed when shields locked and spears rose. This legal and social framework reinforced the secret rule before battle. When oaths were sworn, they were backed by the weight of community judgment. The fear of dishonor could be stronger than the fear of wounds. A man might survive injury, but he could not easily survive disgrace. The result was a culture where discipline was internalized. Warriors held their place not only because of command, but because breaking rank would follow them long after the clash ended. Reputation also extended outward. Enemies who heard of strict internal codes understood they faced not a loose coalition, but a force bound tightly by expectation and consequence. That knowledge magnified the psychological pressure. The Viking line did not hold merely because of training. It held because law, belief, and memory demanded that it do so. Over time, the discipline forged in small warbands expanded into something far greater. What began as tightly bound groups of sworn warriors evolved into coordinated armies capable of reshaping entire kingdoms. When the great heathen army landed in England in 865, it did not resemble the scattered raiding parties that had struck Lindisfarne decades earlier. It arrived as an organized force under leaders such as Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan Ragnarsson, moving with a unity that reflected years of refined practice. This was not chaos unleashed on foreign soil. It was structure in motion. The capture of York in 866 demonstrated how far that structure could reach. The army did not dissolve after victory. It fortified positions, overwintered, and pressed its advantage into the fractured politics of Northumbria and Mercia. Coordination between fleets and land forces allowed rapid shifts in focus. One kingdom could be pressured while another was negotiated with or delayed. The discipline that once held a shield wall together now held campaigns together across seasons and territories. From these campaigns emerged the Danelaw, a vast region of eastern and northern England governed under Scandinavian influence. This transition from raiders to rulers required more than strength. It required internal cohesion strong enough to manage land, tribute, and law. Settlements were established. Trade routes were protected. Armies remained ready, but they were no longer the only instrument of control. Unity allowed stability, and stability allowed permanence. The same foundations later supported the rise of Knut the Great in 1016. His North Sea Empire linked England, Denmark, and Norway under a single crown. Such an achievement demanded coordination across sea lanes and political boundaries. Fleets moved with purpose. Alliances were maintained. Authority was enforced not only through fear but through organized governance. What had once made armies run on open fields now made kingdoms yield at negotiation tables. The secret rule before battle, oath, discipline, cohesion, scaled upward from individual warriors to entire realms. It was not simply a tactic. It was a system. And for generations, that system allowed Viking leaders to do more than win clashes. It allowed them to redraw the map of Northern Europe. But no rule remains unchallenged forever. By the 11th century, the kingdoms that had once trembled before northern fleets began to adapt. Fortified towns rose along vulnerable rivers. Militias were reorganized into rotating systems that ensured fresh defenders stood ready. Kings studied the discipline of their enemies and reshaped their own armies in response. The shock that had once broken lines slowly faded. In 1066, at Stamford Bridge, the discipline that had carried Viking armies across seas met exhaustion and overconfidence. Harold Hardrada's force, hardened and experienced, was caught unprepared by the rapid march of Harold Godwin's son. Even a unified line could falter when surprise and fatigue eroded its foundation. The battle ended in defeat, and with it, the era of large-scale Viking invasions drew to a close. Yet the secret rule did not vanish. It had already transformed from battlefield necessity into legacy. The oath, the discipline, the collective strength that once made armies run had reshaped kingdoms and forced Europe to evolve. In the end, it was never magic or myth that gave them power. It was unity, sworn, enforced, and held together beneath the weight of iron and belief.